The gravel crunched under the cruiser tires as they rolled past the rusted mailbox that clearly bore the name Elijah Carter in fading black letters. A name Elijah himself had painted years ago when he bought the land with money earned the long way, the quiet way, the way no one ever noticed, and as he stood near the tree line watching the red and blue lights bounce off the windows of his farmhouse, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest, not fear exactly but the cold, disciplined awareness that came from decades of training, the kind that never leaves you even when you wish it would, because Elijah Carter was many things. A landowner, a veteran, a widower, a man who preferred silence to conversation. But what no one in that county knew, what no one looking at his worn boots and flannel shirt would ever guess, was that he was also a senior counterintelligence field supervisor for the FBI, home on mandatory leave after dismantling a domestic terror financing ring that had reached further into local institutions than anyone wanted to admit. And when the first officer stepped out of the cruiser with a hand already resting too comfortably near his holster and asked, loud and sharp, "Sir, what are you doing on this property?" Elijah knew instantly this was not going to be a simple misunderstanding, because the question itself carried an accusation, a presumption, a narrative already written, and Elijah replied calmly, evenly, "I own this land." But the officer didn't hear ownership, he heard defiance, and the second officer circled wider, scanning the trees as if danger hid in the shadows rather than standing right in front of them wearing a badge buried deep inside a wallet that would not come out unless absolutely necessary, because Elijah had learned long ago that revealing authority too early could be as dangerous as revealing it too late, and when he asked why they were on his property, they cited an anonymous call about a suspicious individual. Words Elijah had heard too many times in too many contexts, words that followed men like him like a second shadow, and as the encounter escalated with demands for ID and insinuations about stolen land and forged deeds, Elijah felt the slow burn of irony, because just 48 hours earlier he had been briefing a task force on unlawful detentions and civil rights violations, warning them how quickly routine stops turned into career-ending lawsuits and national scandals. Yet here he was, living the case study, and when he handed over his driver's license showing the address that matched the mailbox, the officers barely glanced at it before one muttered that IDs could be fake, that squatters were getting smarter, and that Elijah would need to step away from the house, and that was the moment Elijah realized this wasn't about verification anymore. It was about control, and he complied because compliance, he knew, was sometimes the safest weapon, though every step away from his front porch felt like a small theft, and as neighbors began to gather at a distance, phones rising like digital witnesses, the officers radioed for backup, their tone shifting from suspicion to certainty, because nothing validates a bad assumption like someone else agreeing with it, and when a third cruiser arrived, followed by a county supervisor Elijah recognized instantly from a corruption file he had reviewed months earlier, the situation snapped into dangerous clarity, because now Elijah wasn't just a trespasser. He was a problem, a complication, a man standing on land that sat uncomfortably close to a development deal the county wanted very badly, land Elijah had refused to sell despite pressure disguised as polite offers. And the supervisor's smile was tight as he announced that Elijah was being detained until ownership could be verified. A phrase that sounded procedural but felt like a threat, and when Elijah finally said, quietly, "I'd like to speak to a federal agent," laughter rippled through the group, one officer scoffing that everyone suddenly wanted the FBI when things got serious, and Elijah nodded, because that line always came before the truth landed. And as they moved to cuff him, tightening the metal just enough to hurt, Elijah memorized every face, every badge number, every camera angle, because some habits never die, and in the back of the cruiser, staring through the caged window at his own house growing smaller, Elijah thought about his father, a man who had taught him that land meant dignity, that ownership was a shield history had tried very hard to deny them, and he wondered how many times the system had mistaken patience for weakness. And at the station the narrative hardened further, paperwork filled with assumptions. And he wondered how many times the system had mistaken patience for weakness. And at the station the narrative hardened further, paperwork filled with assumptions, words like non-compliant and evasive. And when Elijah again requested a phone call to his attorney, the request was delayed, then forgotten, then mocked until finally, hours later, a young desk officer typed his name into a federal database out of sheer boredom or curiosity, and the room went very quiet because databases do not lie, and Elijah Carter's name did not just return a hit. It returned a wall, clearance flags, encrypted identifiers, and a direct number labeled "Do Not Delay," and the desk officer swallowed hard as he made the call. And within minutes the station's energy shifted from casual confidence to barely concealed panic, because the voice on the other end did not ask questions. It gave instructions, and when the county supervisor was pulled aside and his face drained of color, Elijah sat calmly. In the holding room, hands still cuffed, breathing slow, because he knew what was coming, and it wasn't revenge, it was exposure. And when the FBI arrived, not in dramatic fashion but in efficient silence, agents in plain clothes moving with purpose, the story unraveled fast, body cam footage reviewed, radio logs cross-checked, anonymous call traced back not to a concerned citizen but to a burner phone linked to a shell company tied to the same development deal Elijah had blocked. And suddenly, trespassing became unlawful detention, reasonable suspicion became racial profiling, and procedure became liability. And as cuffs were removed and apologies stumbled over each other, Elijah didn't smile, because this wasn't a victory. It was a confirmation of everything he already knew. And when he returned home under escort, the sun rising over his land like it always had, agents walked the perimeter not to protect him but to document the truth. And within days the story broke nationally, not because Elijah sought attention but because attention could no longer be avoided. Headlines questioning how many other men without a badge in their pocket had been treated the same way and never had the system turn around and apologize, and the county supervisor resigned for personal reasons. The officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and the development deal quietly dissolved, and Elijah testified before an internal review board with the same calm precision he brought to every briefing, detailing not just what happened to him but how easily it could happen again. And the final twist came weeks later when Elijah declined a promotion and instead requested reassignment to a civil rights task force, because some lessons aren't meant to be survived, they're meant to be taught. And on a quiet evening, standing on his porch as cicadas hummed and the land breathed beneath his feet, Elijah understood that power wasn't in the badge or the gun or the title, but in the truth that eventually forces its way into the light, whether the system is ready or not. And for every man who never gets that moment of revelation, Elijah promised himself he would keep pushing, keep documenting, keep fighting, because this land, this life, this story was bigger than him, and somewhere out there another call was being made, another assumption forming, another line being crossed, and the only difference between injustice and accountability was whether someone was watching closely enough when it happened.